So, if you've seen my feature film, Sheep Theater, I wanted to teach you guys how I did the visual effects in the film. They're one of the places of the film that got the most consistent praise, specifically the Gremlins style effects that I did with the sheep puppets. And I really thought it would be interesting to break it down and show you guys exactly how I did this effect and how I achieved it the best way possible for you to achieve it as well. Whenever you're starting with a practical effect, you need to really think backwards. You need to say, how am I going to make this as tactile as possible? And then figure out how you're going to achieve the effect. A lot of people think of, let's just get the effect done, film it, and then we'll figure out how we're going to make it look realistic in the scene. And the way I looked at it was, okay, first we must make sure this is going to look tactile, that I look like I'm actually responding to the sheep and actually talking to them. So the very first thing I did was I would record what is called a clean plate. Basically, it would be me talking to the sheep specifically. I would leave the sheep in the scene, completely lifeless, and it would at least give me a spot so I could look for an eye line, and it made it very, very simple for me to act out my scenes with emotion because I could see where the characters would potentially be, and I allowed myself to not let my eyes drift too far from where I thought they would end up going. After recording that clean plate, what I would end up doing is I would film the top layer, which would be the sheep moving around. Whatever I would do, I'd film that motion. And basically, I followed a few principles on this. Basically, I made sure that at some point my hand was obscured from where I was touching the sheep from. So let's say if it was on its leg. I made sure that you could never see that my hand was holding that leg. So this might be obscuring it with a table, some DVDs, let's say the little armrest of a chair. I always made sure that I had my hand not directly connected to the sheep in any way. You could still see me completely in the shot, but you couldn't see how I was moving it without assuming that it was my hand. So that was really interesting and was the easiest way to make the effect possible without screwing anything up. The second thing I would do to make sure everything was good was the lighting. I had to make sure that it was consistent. So when I would shoot my clean plate, I would immediately go and shoot the VFX shot because if the lighting changed even at all for a second, you could really possibly lose the whole situation and you would get into editing and the lighting wouldn't match. And then basically the clean plate and the top layer don't have any sort of correlation in terms of lighting, and it makes it a lot harder to match that in post without color correction and a lot of changing the color and lighting to make sure it matches. The third and final thing I would do was make sure I had a limited range of movements. I wanted to make sure that these movements of the characters were things I could legitimately and realistically pull off. I didn't want to do things like backflips or all these crazy moves that I didn't think I could pull off well because in most cases those were a lot more complicated. There's a scene in the film where I had the sheep running on the ground, walking on the ground, and it was the only one I did of that because it was extremely hard to pull off well. So I didn't want to have too many shots of the sheep running around, things that would be a lot more complicated, specifically with the camera angles. The camera angles really mattered as to where we were shooting them. If we shot them from the wrong camera angle, it would be impossible for me to composite them in, and it made it a lot harder when you would do 5 or 6 shots of this and get it all wrong, and then you'd waste 2 or 3 hours. So I started to get really smart with my compositions and know exactly where the sheep needed to be in the frame in order for the composite to be successful. Finally, after doing all those 3 steps, I would bring this project into Premiere Pro. I would then take the bottom layer, the clean plate, then I would put the top layer as the sheep layer where they were moving. I would circle it out and cut the sheep out and put it over the other scene. This ran into a few small problems occasionally. Sometimes the sheep's fur was so noticeable from the underneath layer that it made it a little obvious sometimes, and I had to be very careful with how I masked things. But this really just came down to how tight the mask had to be. If there was a big range, I never really ran into this problem. But if there was a really close area where I had to only have a small mask, it became a little bit more difficult. So I got a little bit better at that and made sure that I spaced the sheep out a little bit further so that I wouldn't have to worry about making the masks very tight and consistent. I can make them very wide and they would look really good. And then basically for the groups of sheep, there was a couple scenes where there's multiple ones. Basically, I would do this process not just once, not just twice, not just 3 times, but 4 times in a scene. I'd have 4 different characters. So I'd shoot a base layer, and then I'd bring in the 4 little characters, and I'd have them all in one shot. The only thing that makes it a little bit harder is trying not to have them cross over in the scene. You don't want to have any movement, because then it makes the mask nearly impossible unless you are really good at VFX or really wanting to spend thousands of hours masking. We actually did one little shot of this very briefly where you can see my hand cross over one of the sheep while it's still moving, just to sell the realism of the puppeteering, and it made it seem like the mask was a little less obvious. So that's another way you can sell the effect if you have time, is to have the masks go over one another, which is really, really cool. So hopefully this demystified a little bit of the sheep characters and how I did them in the film. I hope you enjoy it, and if you haven't seen it, Sheep Eater is a feature film I made in quarantine. It's out right now. It's a horror comedy. I would love if you could check it out, and I would love if you would go give the film a like and a comment with your thoughts on how the practical effects worked in the film. Thank you. Have a good one.